Zach, thanks so much for joining us today. Last week, I sat down with Caroline Lucas the day after Rishi Sunak had effectively reneged on a lot of the 2019 commitments on the climate in the Conservative manifesto. Today, I'm sat down with you a couple of days after he effectively green lighted the Rosebank oil field. Is his attitude to the climate nothing more than environmental negligence?
Well, first of all, I worry if you're the problem that actually we meet with you and then a day later Rishi Sunak or a day earlier says something awful on the environment. More seriously, though, this is an environmental crime, and ultimately the government are entirely complicit. It's gone from bad to worse, and every time you think they're not going to go any further or they can't get any worse than this, they seem to be appealing to that very small, narrow minority that are frankly climate deniers or at best climate delayers. And I think we need to call out the government at every possible opportunity. This makes no sense as a political strategy. I don't know who he's doing focus groups or polls with, but actually the majority of people you speak to care about the climate crisis. Yes, there are questions about making sure the poorest people and the most vulnerable people are protected, but that's at the heart of tackling the climate emergency anyway. So there's this, frankly, complete weird mix of cynicism and pessimism that's coming both from the Conservatives and, frankly, the Labour Party as well, who are not standing up against Rosebank, for instance, that is ultimately going to destroy our planet. So I'm always careful not to talk in hyperbole, but ultimately, when you're talking about an existential crisis, what other words can you use other than this is making you feel physically sick inside? Like, there is an urgency to this that needs to change. And it's not that, there's other issues where the government can do them badly, but at the back of your mind, you go, we will sort this, and it's awful that millions of people are going to suffer, but this, we can sort it out, we can make it better. We won't be able to sort this out. There will reach a tipping point where the damage will totally have been done. And we've arguably, reached some of those tipping points already. And even if we put every climate action into place now, there will be floods and wildfires for the foreseeable future, in fact, for a long time. And we've seen those across southern Europe. But things are going to get much worse. And the hopeful side of this is that everything that we change right now means that can make a difference to billions of people's lives across the world. So I'm not saying throw the towel in for a second, and I'm not saying this isn't worth it. But what I am saying is time is running out and we need to move fast.
Of course, Rishi Sunak says that they are still committed to their net zero commitments. Is that just gaslighting?
I mean, it is just gaslighting. You can't commit what he's doing and then say we're still going to hit this net zero target. And by the way, we already weren't on target. So it wasn't like if we did everything this government was planning to, everything was going to be fine by 2050. And even if we got to net zero by 2050, things still weren't going to be fine. So we were already in a pretty bad situation. But the fact that he is now not even trying to be coherent, the mask has slipped. He's quite happy to just say, oh yeah, everything's going to be fine. I'm just not going to do all of these things that need to happen. And then the other flip side of that, of course, is trashing policy. There wasn't even policy in the first place. No one was talking about 7 bins, or no one was seriously talking about a meat tax. So the fact that he would then create these straw men to then knock down just means that any kind of credibility this government might have, and I don't think they had a lot, has been completely destroyed.
Of course, one of the other things that he suggested, and indeed, as we sit down here, the boss of HS2 has just resigned, we've just learned. But he suggested that there's going to be a significant rollback on that project. Now, if we want to take cars off the road, if we want to incentivise people to use trains, if we want to take freight off the roads, we can't rely on our Victorian infrastructure to do that. Would you agree with that?
Yes, we need high-speed rail and we need to invest in infrastructure. We also need to electrify the railway lines. That can all be true, whilst also saying that turning Birmingham into a commuter town for London is not the high-speed rail project this country needs. Now, the mess we're in seems to be the worst of every world. In terms of the north that badly need this infrastructure, they're now talking about cancelling those legs. I mean, this is a complete mess, and I think ultimately what needs to happen more than anything is the government, this is going to be hard for them, but they need to be transparent. How can we possibly hold them to account or look at what the future of this railway project needs to be if we don't know how much these legs are costing, we don't know exactly what's built, we don't know what percentage is being built? There is a point where you oppose anything, where when something is built so much, you're rubbing against reality, and actually if something is built, then you clearly need to make the best of that bad situation. I can't even sit here today, though, and say that to you because ultimately we don't have the information. And it is inconceivable that on a project this big, one of the biggest in Europe, the government withholding all of this information. And, I can't sit here with any certainty and know what percentages have been built, how much is it going to cost, what is going to happen to these areas in the north. And I thought it was that really telling moment where the mayors all signed that letter to ultimately say, we need this to be built. But even in their own cities, they don't have records of at what point this project is. And this is all not sustainable and it's not tenable. And ultimately, the government, even if it's a cross-party commission, need to sit down and say, because we're looking at a Labour government and this is a huge problem for the future Labour government too, because ultimately they're going to inherit this mess. Now, it'd be very easy for me as someone from another party to just sit and, throw insults at them, or that's not really the way we do politics, but criticise. But that also wouldn't be fair, because ultimately, if they're going to inherit a project that's been this messy, and they're not being told right now what the future of this project looks like, how can a future Labour government possibly make those decisions? So ultimately, the government needs to be more transparent.
Do you know what the cost of an open standard return to Manchester is from London?
I mean, it could be anything between £100 to £200 sometimes. I think the bigger problem that we have is sometimes it is cheaper to fly than it is to get the train. That is a completely unsustainable situation, but it's not a surprise because we are subsidising aviation companies and fossil fuel companies, and we're not subsidising the trains. And this is another yet example of why we need to nationalise the trains. Are you going to give me the exact amount?
£369.40.
Gosh, that's surprising to even me, and I'm from Manchester, so that's a train journey I know well. I'm guessing that's if you're booking on the day. I'm not excusing it for a second, but
it's probably a peak hour open standard return ticket though. So it's people who say. Businesses, for example, we need to get to Manchester for a 9 o'clock meeting. That's a £369 fare.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not justifying it for a second. I think we live in 2023. Frankly, whether we're a business or not, or we just fancy to go see our mates, we should be able to decide this afternoon I'm going to get a train to Manchester. That's not a big, huge, exotic thing to do. And the fact that could put you back £300 if you chose to do that is beyond absurd. Yeah. This is a situation that needs to change, but I think it will only change when we nationalise our railways.
You say that taking air travel is cheaper, and I completely agree. In fact,
I should say I wasn't condoning taking air travel.
No, absolutely, but that's the situation that we find ourselves in. One of the probably even more bizarre things that I've recently learned is that 1 in 10 flights that are now departing the UK are private jets.
Yes, so this private jet situation is beyond absurd, and actually it feels really personal to me because I'm elected in London, so it's my job to hold London Mayor Sadiq Khan to account. Absolutely. Now, the way I work with Sadiq Khan is the way Greens always work, which is to try and cooperate and to always, where we agree on things, applaud those and move that conversation on. But there's another part to that, because you just can't be nice all the time. You've got to expose where there's gaps in his plans. And one of those gaps is I asked him if he would ban private jets in London. Now, he said that's not within his power, and that's a reasonable answer. So then I asked him if he would condemn private jet use in London, and he just refused to do it. Now, I pointed out to him that is literally standing with the 1%. We're talking about the super rich. We're talking about billionaires and millionaires. He is a Labour mayor. It should not be difficult for him to say, I condemn the use of private jets. And his answer to me was that there would be exceptional circumstances where someone would use a private jet. So my next question was inevitable. Can you give me an example of an exceptional circumstance? And his example was time of day. Now, this is in the same breath that he's criticising Rishi Sunak for using a private jet. Now, I agree with him. Rishi Sunak should not be using a private jet. But he is Prime Minister of the country. So if you think the Prime Minister of the country is not an exceptional circumstance where the time of day means he should get a private jet, how can you possibly make the argument that any business should be able to use time of day to use a private jet? Ultimately, that is saying what we already know about much of this Labour Party. They are favouring big business and the super rich over democracy and accountability and ultimately the needs of working people, or frankly, whether they're working or not, every single person in this country. It is completely ludicrous that we live in a society where people feel it is acceptable to use a private jet and politicians are condoning the use of private jets. Ultimately, we need to make sure that people are using trains, or, if they do need to fly, then there is commercial aircraft. But the idea that anyone needs a private jet feels straight out of Succession. It feels like that kind of aspirational politics that is appealing to the right wing and the far right. And ultimately, you can be aspirational, sure. We can support business, sure. But private jets and an environmental emergency is something that needs to be called out every single possible moment.
Of course, one of the environmental commitments that Sadiq Khan has delivered on is ULEZ. The Conservatives say that that's what won them the by-election in Uxbridge and South Ruislip. Should that be of a concern on a national level?
Well, the politics of this is complicated, but I think when you break it down, it's quite clear to me what's gone on here. So the first thing that I think the media don't often talk about is Danny Beales, who was the Uxbridge candidate for Labour in that by-election, was anti-ULEZ. So he was not standing on a pro-ULEZ ticket. It wasn't like, if you wanted to support ULEZ, don't vote for the Conservative candidate, give a clear vote to Labour, because they had a completely mixed message, which is, I'm standing on an environmental Labour ticket, but I also don't support this very basic measure to reduce air pollution in our city. Now, it's always important to point out that ULEZ is not necessarily an environmental measure. In fact, it's to clean air. There is a more complicated conversation about, it does reduce carbon emissions, but primarily it's there to clean up air. Now, it's always important with air to point out that the most toxic air in London and in all our cities is in communities where you have working class communities and black and brown communities. And in London, in outer London, the air is so much worse than inner London. Now, ultra-low emission zone was the right policy, and in fact, Greens have supported Sadiq Khan every single step of the way with this. We argued straight away, though, that there should be bigger money or more money for scrappage schemes, that we should widen the eligibility to make sure that all disabled people are included, that some charities are included. But ultimately, the argument was right, that if inner London should have clean air, then of course outer London should have clean air. We still think we should have probably done it all at once. So rather than having this two-stage process, you make the argument, or the London Mayor should have made the argument, that clean air is for everyone, so we're going to have an ultra-low emission zone everywhere. But ultimately, we are where we are, and Sadiq Khan took the approach he did. I don't think it was the right approach, but I think it was the right policy. So it was important to support him, so I have done. I think in terms of what are reflections, though, for the climate emergency, I think the reflections are really clear. You need solid, clear leadership. You can't sit on the fence on this. You can't mix messages. You can't have candidates going out there saying, yes, clean air is important, the climate is important, but I'm not willing to ask people to make what is quite a simple measure to do, which is there's a scrappage scheme, we need better public transport, you need to walk and cycle, or get on a bus, or get on the tube. London has some of the best public transport in the world, and I think it's important we ask people to do that. I think there is a legitimate conversation that in some of those outer London boroughs, the public transport is not yet good enough, which is why we need to be using the money from ULEZ and lobbying national government to make sure we are improving public transport system, particularly in those places that are less accessible. So all of those things can be true at the same time. I think in terms of nationally, though, with the climate emergency, we need to move away from the conversation that's about banning things or sacrificing things. And we actually need to talk about the fact that tackling the climate emergency is an opportunity to create good green jobs. Those green jobs need to be unionized. Those green jobs should be in the public sector or whether in the private sector. We need to make sure that people are being paid properly, that we don't have CEOs or heads of companies earning ridiculous amounts whilst the person on the lowest wage is earning not enough that's a living wage. I think also it's about making sure we have cleaner air, more cohesive communities. We can tackle the gender pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap, the disability pay gap. All of these things are things that we need to do in and of themselves. The fact we have a climate emergency is an opportunity to create whole new industries that both tackle some of those deep inequalities in our society and also make sure that we've got a green path and a greener future.
It is funny how many negative connotations are associated with net zero, but if someone made the green industrial revolution sexy and sort of, something that we can see delivering jobs and delivering for communities, then surely that would be a better message to people in terms of getting people behind it.
I always think the question is, imagine yourself in 2050, 2060, 2070. What sort of society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in the society which is the road we're going down right now? In fact, Liz Truss was not an aberration. She was a natural kind of extension of that road. That's where we end up if we allow conservative free market ideology just to run wild. It's essentially survival of the fittest, and it's capitalism on steroids. And I would say the Labour Party have bought into that vision too. When they talk about their fiscal rules or there's no money left, essentially what they're saying is they are not willing to tax the wealthiest. They are not willing to have a serious look at our economy and rebalance it. So that is the road that we are on right now. That's the path. But we could be on another path. We could be on a path where actually we say to the people with the broadest shoulders, the wealthiest in the society, we need you to pay a little bit more. So the Green Party wealth tax, for instance, there's various ways you could do a wealth tax. One of my preferred ways is a super tax on the 1%. So 1% tax on the richest 1%. That would raise about £75 billion a year that you could then put into green investment. You're also making sure that you're looking at something like a universal basic income. This would lift people out of poverty. Martin Luther King, in fact, quite a while ago said this could literally eradicate poverty. This is the idea that every single citizen, no matter whether they're working or not working, gets a basic amount of money for things like rent, transport, food, basic existence. This should not be contentious. This is about basically saying that in 2050, I think this in 2023, but also in this future vision, no citizen should ever be living without a roof above their head or without food in their tummy. That seems like a basic thing that any government should be doing. Now, you can do that. It's effectively cost net zero in terms of if you're abolishing the ridiculous sanction schemes we have, the amount of universal credit schemes we have, and actually just saying, let's protect everyone. Now, there is question there about, people with disability or people with benefits right now, but you have what's called the better off mechanism. You make sure that no one is worse off when they have a basic income, and you make sure that's baked in from the very beginning, co-designing that with communities. So that's also something we could have in the future. And then finally, you have these climate measures. You have measures where you say we create a society where people are able to walk and cycle. They feel safe to be able to do so. They're able to get on public transport that's frequent, that's accessible and affordable. All of these things are not the moon on the stick. All of these things are possible. And one of the things I love about them is we know what the solutions are. We know we can invest in renewables. Carla Denyer, who's the co-leader of the Green Party and running to be the next MP in Bristol Central, she was a renewables engineer before she was a politician. She became a politician because she ultimately said the barriers to investing in renewables were not money, they were not technology. They were entirely political. And so if you're facing political barriers, the thing to do is to get involved with politics and change those barriers. If you don't have time to get involved in politics, and I appreciate that's not for everyone, then the thing you do is vote for a Green, make sure we have more Green MPs in Parliament, and we'll remove those barriers.
We were in Leuven, which is a city just outside Brussels, and they have some remarkably interesting, progressive things going on there, especially in relation to the climate, where they are effectively booting cars off the road. But the mayor, who has developed this strategy in collaboration with local institutions, it's a learned city, it's got brilliant educational setup, and it's got a lot of really interesting companies that are getting involved in this. He effectively put it in a similar way that you did, which is it's all good pushing people away from cars, but you've also got to pull them towards something that replaces that, and makes it easier. So they have electric bus routes that are brilliant. Their cycling lanes are great. It's really nice to walk around that city. And that's the sort of thing that we've got to be thinking about.
100%. And I think the other thing that attaches to that is the language of freedom. And the right wing are very good at this language of freedom. They talk about your freedom and your liberty. But actually, what about the freedom to not own a car? What about the freedom to not feel like you're living in car dependency? So many people I know who still drive. So this isn't me attacking, my friends who drive or anyone who drives. But they talk about sitting in commutes and sitting in traffic for hours and hours on end. Just think about how many hours of your life you're sat in a car going to a job that you might not even want to go to, that you don't enjoy, that doesn't feel like you have purpose in your life. I think we need to talk about the freedom for people to be able to make those decisions, to be in the places they want to be, to travel how they want to, and to protect the environment. As with anything green, though, I think ultimately the government's job here, or any local government's job, is to make sure that the cheapest, easiest option is always the green option. And you can do that by nudging people, or what I much prefer is you do that by subsidizing it and making it cheaper. Right now we are subsidizing fossil fuel companies to millions, if not billions of pounds. We are not subsidizing these good green options. And we know exactly why this is, frankly. It's because rich donors of oil and gas companies or gambling companies, are giving to the Conservative Party, and some of them are giving to the Labour Party too. I give gambling as an example, and I think there's certainly some MPs where when you look where their private donations came from, or private healthcare companies, for instance, you can see why they're not doing things that are in the public good. So again, financial transparency and donor transparency is a really important part of this. I think if you're a politician and someone is donating to your campaign, you should be super transparent what they're expecting in return for that money.
Suella Braverman was in the US this week, and she declared that multiculturalism has failed. Now, a lot has been said about what she said. What is interesting to me is where she said it. The first speech was at a Conservative think tank. She returned home to give her first interview to the deputy chair of the Conservative Party on GB News. Should that be of concern to British people?
So first of all, it should be of huge concern. I don't think anyone with decency or values could have watched Suella Braverman's speech and not have thought, that does not represent me. That does not represent the sort of country I want to live in. That does not represent my community. And even where people have concerns about immigration, that I would disagree with those concerns, but I recognise that their concerns are well-meaning or well-intentioned or coming from a place of fear, I think they would still watch that and say, no, that's for depths of depravity in a place that we should not be going. Now, this has all happened to me in an interesting context. I visited Burnley recently. We have Green councillors there. They're doing amazing work. And in fact, at every local election recently, they have grown that Green councillor base. Now, Burnley is not somewhere that I think a lot of people would expect Greens to do well. It's literally been a Labour heartland in the past. And it's been amazing to see Greens on the ground, knocking on doors and making those arguments. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up Burnley in this context is Burnley, some people will know, have had a past both in terms of the Burnley race riots, as they were described, and also the BNP got their first representation in Burnley. And so I'm reading this book called On Burnley Road because when I went to visit, I just became fascinated with what did happen in that area. And this book talks about how Burnley was always dismissed as a kind of a unique place that had its own particular circumstances, and this wasn't going to happen with the rest of the country. But actually the exact opposite happened. We saw these conversations happen in Burnley, and then the country had a national conversation around Brexit, around immigration, and I think we're still feeling the effects of that conversation. And in Burnley, they learnt some really important lessons that I think have not been extrapolated across the rest of the country. And any politician, particularly when they're talking about issues of race or immigration, could do really well both to read this book, to visit Burnley and talk to people, but also to frankly think about these conversations in a more holistic way. So the first thing I would say is some of these things are well known, but don't get talked about enough. When people talk about fears of immigration or fears of multiculturalism, I think what they're really talking about is fears of Tory austerity, fears of 13 years of not building enough housing, not making sure there's enough GPs, not making sure that if you go to an A&E, you will be seen quick enough. It's always important to point out that if you use the National Health Service, the person who is serving you is more likely to be an immigrant than someone who is in front of you in the queue. Our country is built on migration. Whether that's for better or for worse, we've got that horrific history of colonialism and empire, but also right now in our country, we have this beautiful history of where that tapestry essentially in our city as well, in London, I think is one of the beautiful examples of this. Our country is made up of all of those different stories. They're individual stories, but ultimately when they come together, that collective voice and that collective story is who we are. And I think we work best as a country and as a city when we recognise the value that people bring. So I think that's the first thing, is to address people's concerns about infrastructure and austerity. And I mean, the obvious answer to that is stop austerity, invest, make sure we're putting money into things, stop telling false narratives that the Labour Party are doing about fiscal rules or saying there's no money left. All of those things perpetuate this conversation and ultimately end up in the far right's grasp, because what you're doing is creating this lack of resource, and you're telling a story that your neighbour or someone you don't know is getting something you're not, and that's always going to create these problems. So that was the first thing I learned from Burnley. I think the second thing is about the importance of people talking to each other. So they looked at Belfast, where obviously they'd had their own problems with troubles and different communities coming together. And they decided to do a mediation service in Burnley where they brought people together, and particularly from the Asian community and from the British white community, said, let's start having conversations. Now, what I love in this book is they say peacekeeping is not easy. It's not friendly and cuddly, because if you get two people who agree on something, that's not peacekeeping. They're just having a nice conversation. Difficult conversations is about getting people in a room together who vastly disagree on something to quite a visceral extent. Now, you've got to make a space, and the devil is in the detail here, that is safe, where people feel like they're able to communicate, that they don't feel, physically at harm or emotionally at harm. But there is a space where people can have these solid, robust conversations, where they can air their fears. And I think if we could create a culture in this country where you both have to do this top-down and grassroots. The top-down is where we're absolutely failing at the moment, where we have ministers like Suella Braverman and, frankly, Rishi Sunak, and again, the Labour opposition, where they're not leading on this. They're actually appealing to people's worst fears to differing extents. Even where they're opposing, Keir Starmer opposes the stop the boats mantra, but he opposes it because it's inefficient, not because it's inhumane. He opposes it because he's saying it's costing too much money. But actually what we really need is that clear, solid leadership that talks about the fact that migrants shouldn't just be tolerated or accepted. They should be celebrated. And we need people in that top-down position telling those stories. But ultimately, this will not come solely from top down. We need that grassroots work. We need local councils investing in making sure we're bringing communities together, that we have shared spaces. So it's not that, you have communities that are isolated and just stick together, but actually you have those areas where people feel free, like they can mix and integrate. I was an artist before I was a politician, so my natural kind of instinct is always, let's look at theatre, let's look at music, let's look at art. How can we create those stories that tell a collective story about who we are and ultimately where we want to go to? But, this isn't kind of some lefty kind of lovey, let's bring artists together. I think there's other ways of doing that. Sport is another brilliant way. I love sport too, but ultimately bringing people together, whether it's football or other sports where people can play on the collective team and work towards a common goal. I mean, the limit is only as much as our imagination goes, but I think the ultimate point here is multiculturalism works when people are in a shared space where they're working together. The very final thing I'd say on this is from the Jewish community, and there was a chief rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who's now sadly died, but he was really interesting on these points, and he wrote a book talking about creating a home together. And he said, ultimately, a hotel is where everyone is tolerated, but you have your own space. You go to your own space, and you don't necessarily mix. You might hang out in the lobby, but that's not really a home. It's not a sense of shared space. A home is what we should be looking to build together. A place where, yes, people have differences. We shouldn't all be the same. We shouldn't even all agree on everything. There should be differences, and some of those differences will be particularly difficult sometimes. But within those difficult differences, learning to navigate those, to tolerate those, and to accept those is what creates a better society. And we can only do that when politicians speak with the clarity, the authenticity, and the compassion it requires.
Nice.
That was a very long answer.
It's a good
big
one.
question.
It's a really good one. Has it surprised you at all that Sir Keir Starmer, a former human rights lawyer, knighted for being a former human rights lawyer, hasn't been more vocal on issues such as the Rwanda policy?
I always want to talk about politicians in a positive light, and the Green Party do politics differently. So we're always looking to not slander people or just to criticize people for criticism's sake. Keir Starmer is making that increasingly difficult. I mean, this is a man who stood on a particular platform, talked about being friends with Jeremy Corbyn, painted himself as some sort of left-wing progressive that was ready to inform the country and work with people and collaborate and listen. And we've seen him U-turn on almost every possible outcome he could do. We've seen him say that he won't stand with striking workers, or government shouldn't stand on picket lines with striking workers. Just to deal with that one very quickly, a government, if they are not going to listen and stand literally shoulder to shoulder with the people who are making this country run, who are saying we want to talk to and we want to stand on this picket line, if you can't even be seen to be listening, what are you doing when you're not being seen? What are you doing when you're in the corridors of power, but you feel like you don't need people's votes anymore? I mean, that is grim. We've seen him U-turn on the environment. We've seen him talk about that Rosebank is now acceptable, despite the fact that the carbon emissions are equivalent of 28 of the lowest income countries, all their emissions put together. We've seen him U-turn again on migration. He's refusing to tell that positive story. Does it surprise me? No, it doesn't surprise me, because I think even when Keir Starmer was running for the leadership, I think you get a sense of who someone is and who they care about. Now, I differ with Jeremy Corbyn on some issues, and I don't want to be disingenuous about that. There's lots of places where I actually sit in the same place and I'm really proud to be continuing some of the work he was doing. And I'm seeing increasingly more people who used to support Jeremy Corbyn joining the Green Party. And I'm really, really clear that for those people, the Labour Party has left them. They are politically homeless. They don't have a home. And I think the Green Party can be their home. But that does not mean that I stand entirely on Jeremy Corbyn's platform. I think an obvious place is to talk about the European Union. I think Jeremy's instincts on the European Union, I'm not making things up here. I think, he was pretty clear on this before he was leader. He was Eurosceptic, and he never felt like Europe, the UK had a place in Europe. Now, I can understand that Euroscepticism. I can understand when people say that the European Union is not perfect. I don't claim for a second it is perfect. But I think when you look at the problems facing us, like the climate crisis, global problems, international problems require international solutions. And I think we are so much better off within the European Union trying to reform it from within than what we're doing right now, which is we're seeing our environmental protections degraded, because when the government talked about cutting red tape, really that was just code for deregulation. I mean, it wasn't even that, code. They were talking about deregulation. And we're seeing that deregulation means we've literally got crap in our rivers. Now, there's crap in rivers all over the world, so the European Union or all over Europe isn't going to solve that in and of itself. But the collective solidarity of countries coming together and saying, no, let's have some standards on this where we can work with European neighbours that are then the guidance is seen in the UK, I think is a step forward. Now, Europe is always complicated because as Greens, we always want people to have power at the lowest possible level they can. Everyone should feel like on their local street or in their local park or in their local village hall that they have access to their local councillor. And that's right. Power should be at the most local level it can be. But also when we talk about strategy, you want that to be as high level as you can. You want that to be the headlines and that umbrella term. And I think the European Union has the ability to do that. And I feel like Jeremy had that kind of 1970s and even earlier view of the European Union that didn't tap into the potential of what it could be. Now, I don't want to over-egg that. I don't think that's, a huge rift between me and the previous Labour leadership. But I think, I just always want to be honest that there are differences
Absolutely,
there.
yeah.
But anyway, let's talk about the similarities. I think that kind of view of talking about poverty, about making sure that if essentially, if you lift people in poverty, if you lift the poorest, most vulnerable people in our country out of the circumstances they live in, that is good for everyone. And that's the opposite of trickle-down economics, that ridiculous notion that if you help the wealthiest and the richest, then somehow that will help everyone. That doesn't work. But what does work is if you protect the poorest people and you make sure that their circumstances are better, we know that a more equal society is good for everyone. And by the way, that does include the super rich too. Many will remember Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson's amazing book, The Spirit Level. They wrote that almost 10, 20 years ago, I think. But ultimately that talks about where you have a society that is more equal, that reduces crime, includes improves people's healthcare, because ultimately, that results in a better national health service. All of that kind of equality in society is good for everyone, whether you're poor or whether you're rich, and reducing inequality in our society has to be one of the number one things that we can do. So to come back to your question directly, does it surprise me that Keir Starmer is going back on these things, or as a human rights lawyer, he doesn't seem to be standing for the right things? No, because I think Jeremy Corbyn was roughly in the right place on all of those things. And I think no matter what you think about Jeremy, the fact that he galvanized millions of people in this society, particularly some of the youngest people, to be excited about politics for the first time is something we should absolutely be championing. And I think, when you see Keir Starmer say he was never even my friend, it just seems so petty and narrow-minded. All politics aside, do you want someone to be the leader of this country who is essentially, there's no description of that behavior other than snakish. To stand with someone and say they're my friend, to kick them out the party, to suspend them, and then to say, oh no, they were never my friend. It's complete hypocrisy, and I think it tells you something about the character of the person. And as I say, I always want to talk about politics, not people, but you've asked me a question about the person, and that's my answer.
Absolutely. Jeremy told us this week that he went to the CBI conference the day after Boris Johnson's infamous Peppa Pig talk, and he said straight to the people who high up in business, run some of the biggest companies that in this country, you will pay more, but I will return to you a happier, healthier, more educated workforce. There's nothing controversial about that, is there?
100%, and I think it's so easy to paint these ideas as anti-business, and it is not anti-business at all. In fact, let's start with independent small businesses. They absolutely have to be at the root of a green revolution. Ultimately, everything I'm talking about power being at the localist level, about people, feeling like they have empowerment around their community, small business is a huge part of that. Now, I'm always wary when people talk about consumers. Ultimately, we will always be citizens, but we can be citizens who consume. We can be citizens that make choices about where to spend our money. We can be citizens that enjoy on our local high street that we have, some independent business move in. I think all of those things should be celebrated. I think what I hear more and more is people, are really unhappy when they see the high street closing down. When you see those shops with nothing in them. I think particularly, when I go visit seaside towns, many of those have that awful phrase left behind. I don't like the phrase left behind because we can reach those places. We can bring those places in. There's just a result of political choices not to. But I think ultimately that doesn't feel good for anyone. It's not good for business and it's not good for the community. But also, frankly, big business can also have a role. But it can have a role paying tax properly, it can have a role looking after its staff properly, and it can have a role making sure that it's serving public good and ultimately not destroying the planet, not destroying the environment, but serving people and serving people's needs. So I think we can absolutely be pro-business, and that's not selling out, that's not losing our values. It's just about making it really clear about what sort of society do we want to live in. And of course, business has a place in that society. It just has to pay taxes properly.
Absolutely. What would you say to people who say the Labour Party will actually be a lot more radical than it's letting on at the moment?
I think people are really wishful thinking if they think the Labour Party are going to get any more radical. Now, look, I can understand the hope. I see the same thing that everyone else does. I see 13 years of a Tory government, and I feel, and I know the poorest people in our society will feel this even more viscerally, I feel the pain, I feel the grief, and I feel the collective trauma. I think everyone has that experience where you walk past a homeless person on the street, and you've got those choices. You go, do I just reach in my pocket and give them some money? And that's what I used to do, because I used to think no matter what the government is doing, it's not that person's fault. I want to give them some money. And then you kind of go, oh, well, am I fueling addiction, or am I making things worse? And actually, am I letting the government get away with things? But then I think, well, if I am fueling addiction, if I was sitting on the street and I was freezing and I didn't have any food, I might want to take something that just takes my mind and my feeling away from this physical experience for a few moments. And then you have that moment where you go, this is all so complicated, all of these questions. But actually, the much bigger question is, why is this situation even happening at all? And this situation is happening even at all because the government have made some very conscious decisions to not protect some people in society, to dismiss some people in society, to demonize some people in society. And so when you walk past that person who is homeless in the street, I feel that feeling, and I feel it as a politician, but I would feel it, I would imagine, even if I wasn't elected, of what can I do? What physically can I do more in the next hour, next 10 minutes, in the next second? Is it sending a tweet? Is it doing a press release? Is it going, okay, we need this motion, we need to do this now? What is the most urgent thing I can do to stop homelessness in the street? And so when an opposition party comes along and has rhetoric that says, I'm going to end homelessness, I can completely understand where every instinct in people is to go, I want to support that, because even if I don't quite believe them, or even if it doesn't feel like they're good enough, at least we will change the situation. At least we will end homelessness. But I just don't think any of those things will happen. I think when you look at what this Labour Party believe, and this is when they've got a sniff of power, they're not even in power yet. We've seen that they don't follow through on what they say. We've seen that at every moment where they have a political choice that might be difficult, or might require some moral courage or some leadership, they have backed down, or they have moved closer to the Conservative position. Now, the devastating thing about the Labour Party moving closer to the Conservative position is the Conservatives go, we don't have our position anymore, we need to go even more right-wing. So I'm really clear that when people say I'm going to vote Labour to get the Tories out, what that is resulting in, and I know people don't mean to do this, but the Conservative Party go even further right-wing. They go, if people are going to vote Labour because they're close to oppositions, then what we need to do is out-Tory even the Tories. And that's what the Tory party are doing right now. We've seen it with Suella Braverman on migration. We've seen it with Rishi Sunak on the climate. We've seen it with the Education Secretary when even protecting school buildings and crumbling just felt like it was too much for them if they weren't being praised enough. And I think this idea of a tactical vote for a party that are going to be in the same place as the Conservatives. And be really clear, Keir Starmer's party is to the right of where David Cameron was when David Cameron implemented austerity in 2010 with the Liberal Democrat government. If you think that's a tactical vote, then I don't know what a tactical vote is. Because ultimately, yes, you will get the Tories out, but you will get a bunch of people who are essentially standing on a Conservative manifesto, who will implement Conservative policies, and you won't be able to say, let's get the Conservatives out, because they will be out, but we will have what is essentially a Conservative government in all but name. Now, all of that is very grim and pessimistic, so where is the hope? Well, I would naturally say this, but I really believe it too, that the hope is the Green Party. We have demonstrated at local elections in the last few years, we have over quadrupled our local councillor base. So yes, first past the post is incredibly unfair. And yes, we are up against it with first past the post, but we have demonstrated that where we work hard and when people support us and vote, even under first past the post, the Green Party wins. So let's take as two case examples, Brighton Pavilion and Bristol Central, which are two of our target seats. The amazing Sian Berry in Brighton Pavilion, looking to carry on Caroline Lucas's legacy, and Carla Denyer, who is our co-leader in the party, standing in Bristol Central. If people don't vote, so first of all, the Tories can't win in those two seats. That's really clear, first of all. There's lots of places in this country where the fight is between the Labour Party and the Green Party. Where the Conservatives can't even win, if you vote Green, the very worst case scenario is you get the Labour Party MP you would have got anyway. Now I would argue that Labour Party MP is standing on a manifesto that is pretty right-wing, or at best is centre-right. But if you vote with your heart, and you vote hopefully, and you say, actually, if enough people in this country do this, if you want environmental, social, racial, and economic justice, if you vote Green, you can change that narrative, you can change that story. We are not observers just watching this kind of story play out that we're not involved with. The Conservative Party have tried to create that complacency within the British population, but everyone has the agency to vote with their heart and to vote with their head. And actually, the most tactical vote you can make is voting for the Green Party, because every single Green vote that amasses around the country sends a clear signal to those two old parties that the script has changed, that people want the policies that we are advocating, that they want to tackle wealth inequality in this country, that they want to protect those who are poorest in society, and that they want to protect the environment. A vote for people and planet is a vote for the Green Party, and that's the most tactical vote you can make.
All the indications at the moment suggest that we're looking at a Labour administration next. It might not be as big as people think right now, and it may even require some sort of a coalition. We don't know, obviously, but that's sort of the indications that we're getting now. But if there was a green wave sort of over here, would that force Sir Keir Starmer to have a little think about how he keeps the party in power?
Yes, totally. And you don't have to use much imagination for this. I can give you an example, which is in London. We have London Mayor Sadiq Khan, and then you have 3 Green Assembly members. You don't have to take my word for this. Sadiq Khan himself often says that the Green Party have moved his position on things. Now, he said to me that I chivvy him along. I think that's patronising. I think what I'm doing is a lot more than chivvying, but I will take it. If, the basic idea is that the Green Party come up with good ideas, the Labour Party say, oh, we can't do that, that's a little bit radical. We do 2 things. 1, we use the data, so we use evidence, we prove our point. And 2, persistence. We just keep going on about it until we change the dial. And we've proven time and time again with some big policies that we have moved London Mayor Sadiq Khan to different places. An example, Sian Berry, my colleague in the Assembly, but is also now running for Brighton, she made the case for local youth services. People say a lot, what are we going to do about knife crime or stabbings? And, these are really, really serious. Now, one route you can go down is talk about policing, but actually communities, particularly ethnic minority communities, talk regularly about the fact that they're being over-policed and under-protected. More policing cannot be the solution to this. I think the much more interesting and salient conversation is, why is this happening to young people? Why do they feel like they've got nowhere to go? And it doesn't take you long to see that youth services have been decimated. They've been destroyed. And actually, people don't have places to go. These young people are just out on the streets. They don't necessarily have role models or youth workers. And Sian made this case over and over again. and pointed out that although she couldn't change what national government were doing, one thing London Mayor could do was ring-fence local youth services. And she secured huge amounts of money for youth services. That was by pointing out the evidence, and that was through persistence. Now, it's no coincidence that I'm talking about Sian, because I hope to see Sian Berry MP in the next Parliament. Keir Starmer should be worried. She will hold his feet to the fire in every single possible moment, in the same way we've seen Caroline Lucas do with Rishi Sunak. Yeah. I just think with a Labour Prime Minister, that is amplified, because Rishi Sunak can try and dismiss Greens, and to be fair to the Conservatives, our ideology is totally different from them. We want to protect people and planet. They're very clear that that is not really what they're looking to do. But Keir Starmer as Prime Minister would not be able to shrug off Green MPs. Every single Green MP we have in Parliament will push Keir Starmer to the left, will push him to more progressive values, will push him to make better policy. It is vital that we get 4, 5, I don't know how many Green MPs, but every single vote for a Green MP in the country is building that case to the Labour Party that you can't ignore poverty, you can't ignore the climate emergency, and you can't ignore people that want the Green Party.
To those a little like me with those beliefs who might feel politically homeless right now, that's the message, isn't it? You might be politically homeless, but put your vote in the Green Party, and at worst, you'll get a Labour administration that has to start listening to your voice.
Yeah, I love the way that you've described yourself there, because really this interview now just becomes, well, how do I get you to join the Green Party? And my guess would be, if I said, why haven't you done it before? This is from lots of people I've spoken to. There's usually 2 reasons. The first reason, I would say, is stereotypes and expectations. They think we're the party for polar bears. Now, let me be very clear. I really care about polar bears, so this is not dismissing polar bears. And I really care about the environment, and I think everyone knows that about the Green Party. But they feel like maybe we weren't supporting trade unions enough, or we didn't kind of get a class politics, or we didn't understand the kind of wealth inequality in this society. I hope from everything that I've been saying in this interview, but more than saying, you just look at the voting record of Greens across the country, both Caroline Lucas, but also at local and regional government. We have demonstrated over and over again that we understand that this is holistic, that this is systemic, and ultimately, you need to get to the root of problems. And the root of almost every problem in our country right now, I would say, is austerity. And that includes the root of the climate emergency. It's austerity. It's the fact we've not invested in renewables or green infrastructure. So that's the first thing, I think, is stereotypes. And that's why I'm always really happy to do interviews like this, because I feel we can smash those stereotypes and say to people, if you want us to be talking about the things that you want to care about, then actually I think we're probably in that place. I'm always open to conversation. So if people think, you've not quite tapped into this, you've not talked about healthcare enough or education enough. I mean, my first answer would be, you can't talk about everything all the time. But my second answer is, sure, let's have a chat about that, because there might be something I'm missing. You don't know what you don't know, and let's learn more and keep progressing. But then the second biggest reason, I think, why people haven't voted for us in the past is they thought we couldn't win. Now, whenever you look at polling, if you say to people, what party do you like the most, or what party aligns with your values, the Green Party consistently, by a country mile, come out well ahead. Now, I'm not saying that translates to national representation. It clearly doesn't. We've only got 1 MP. But when you look at elections, the 2017 election, we got over 1 million votes, and we got 1 MP. Conservative Party could get, I think it was 38,000 votes, and get 1 MP for every 38,000. So there is a massive disparity, and this is why we badly need proportional representation. But as I've said already, even under first past the post, we can still win. Now, winning at local government is really important, firstly, because people need local representation. I would make the argument, it would be a longer conversation, that local representation is sometimes even more important than national representation, because actually the things that really matter to people, like youth services, their library, their local area, their local park, their local health services, often those are devolved. So it really matters at local government what is going on. So that's the first reason why I'm really happy that we're smashing local government and really winning those elections. But the second reason is because it completely dispels this myth that Greens can't win. We have demonstrated that if people vote people vote nationally the same way they do locally, the simple response is we will get more Green MPs. And again, when you look at Bristol, I think there's 14 councillor seats, 12 of them are now Green. You just do the maths and you go, if people vote the same way nationally as they did last May, or the May before, then you will have the next Bristol MP being a Green MP. And I think that's exciting for Bristol. Brighton proved this in 2010, that I think there's something beautiful when your city or town does something different. Actually, as a collective community, you go, we can be really special here and we can have a Green MP. And Bristol can do that in the next election. Waveney Valley can do that with Adrian Ramsey. North Herefordshire can do that with Ellie Chowns. I won't list all our target candidates now, but I think it is important that people know, particularly if they're in these areas, that we are massively targeting those areas, and voting Green will absolutely result in a Green MP.
And of course, it's been proven in Europe how Green parties can get in and make a huge difference at a national level too.
Yes, and we don't even have to go as far as that. We can look at Scotland, where Greens are in coalition, they're in government, in Germany, where they're in government, and lots of other places too. I regularly go, so although we're out of the European Union, I'm still very connected to the European Green Party. Once a year, I go to a leaders' congress, so I go to meet with all the other deputy leaders and leaders of Green parties around Europe. And in fact, this year I was sat on the table with the leaders of Ukraine and Switzerland. One, that was a real demonstration of what we've done as a country leaving Europe, that we were kind of, a table that was essentially other. All the other European parties in the EU were on tables together, and we were kind of the miscellaneous table. So that was a real stark reminder of that. But also, just talking to all of these people around the country, the Prime Minister of Montenegro, the cabinet ministers in various countries that are Green politicians. And you go, none of this has to take a long time. Actually, they've demonstrated they were having the exact same conversation we were having. They were saying, we are not the stereotype you think we are. We have a holistic, systemic view of politics, and we've demonstrated at a local level we can win. There's only so long before that momentum takes charge and ultimately results in more Greens running things, being in opposition. I should also be really clear in this country, my target right now is not to have a Green Prime Minister. I mean, that would be great, but also I think, that's a bit Lib Dem 2019, where, they start imagining impossible things too soon. My target is to have a Labour government with Green MPs holding that Labour government to account, but crucially on those vital things that need to change, inequality and the climate emergency. And I think that is more than doable. I think it's likely, but I'm not complacent about it. We need people to vote for it.
Zack Polanski, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.